Okay, so before we get into this video properly, I'm gonna need to say a few things. Firstly, I understand that saying do not buy is a rather strong statement to make. My do not buy videos are usually reserved for games that have a lot of issues and problems when they first release, and I think it's important to point out that I'm only talking about the factual problems and not just my own opinions. Now, granted, me putting the title as do not buy Pokémon Scarlet and Violet is quite harsh, but like all of my recommendations and reviews, this is nothing more than a suggestion or perhaps some advice. I mean, let's face it, most of you that wanted the game have probably already bought it at this point, and you're just here to see what my opinions are on the subject. Pokémon games will sell no matter what I or anyone else thinks about them, so once again, all I can do is offer you an alternate viewpoint or perhaps a different perspective. I've reviewed a few other monster catching games outside of Pokémon on this channel, so some of you may have heard this before, but I am a lifelong Pokémon fan. I was there in 1998 when it all began, and I still love the franchise to this day. I own a lot of Pokémon games, Blu-rays, merch, trading cards, and figures. Basically, if you name it, I've probably owned it at some point. I absolutely do not hate Pokémon in any way, and this video has not been made to attack the franchise. In fact, I'd actually say this is the most fun I've had with a mainline Pokémon game since the mid-2000s. The core gameplay loop and the concepts that Scarlet and Violet introduce are brilliant, but this has to be the ugliest and worst performing game that I've played in a very long time. Graphics and visuals aren't everything, of course. I've always been a gameplay over graphics guy myself, but what's on display here is frankly kind of embarrassing. In order to enjoy the gameplay, you have no choice but to suffer through the headache or nausea-inducing performance issues and some exceedingly unpleasant graphics. There's also some design choices and omissions that don't really help matters, but I'd say those are closer to opinions rather than objective facts, but we'll get to those later. All in all, I'm about 40 hours into the game, and surprisingly, I'm having a good time with my adventure. The problem is that you're constantly reminded of the missed potential and, of course, the unacceptable quality level. Pokémon is one of the biggest franchises on planet Earth, yet Nintendo and Game Freak seem incapable of making a game that runs as well as third-party games do on their own console. I'm sorry, but I do not subscribe to the modern attitude of releasing a game now, take the money and fix it later. That's the main reason I don't believe you should buy Pokémon Scarlet or Violet in its current form, at least for the time being. So I don't think I need to go over what a Pokémon game is, as we all know exactly what they're all about. Although, if you played Pokémon Sword and Shield but didn't play Pokémon Legends Arceus, then there may be some new additions that are worth mentioning. The first is that the game is now fully open world, allowing you to go anywhere at any time, with some minor restrictions which are tied to story progression. Wild Pokémon aren't encountered in long grass anymore, and they're visible at all times in the game world. Colliding with one of these Pokémon in the open world initiates a battle, but it doesn't load you into a separate battle screen. Instead, the fight takes place right there and then in the overworld. While you're in a battle, the catching mechanics are virtually the same as always, but it is worth noting for people who did play Legends Arceus that the catching mechanics from that game do not return here. You can't catch anything outside of a battle, instead you'll have to actually battle the target, weaken it, and then throw Pokeballs at it. You're not required to catch 20 plus copies of the same Pokemon either. The second major change is that the story and the objectives aren't linear anymore, at least for the most part. You can practically go wherever you want and take on the game's challenges in any order. Having said that, Pokemon levels do not scale to you, so if you decide to go and do a specific gym first, you could get utterly destroyed, so there are some limits to the freedom. The game features 3 different paths to progression, which again can be approached in any order that you decide. There's the typical story thread of beating the 8 gyms and fighting the Elite Four, there's the Team Star camps that you need to invade and take over, and then there's the 5 Titan Pokemon which when defeated unlock exploration tools such as gliding or speed boosts. There's also the terrestrialized system which allows you to turn your Pokemon into a crystal version of itself. It gets to wear a large crystal hat, but most importantly, it changes its type. There are of course some other minor differences like the Pokemon centers being outdoors, crafting TMs, and the auto-battling system where you can throw out a Pokemon in front of you so that it can one-shot Pokemon in the wild. This nets you much less XP than a normal battle, but it is far quicker, and it's a great way to obtain Pokemon materials which are used for crafting those TMs. I'm sure I'm missing some other stuff here and there, but it's not really that important. This isn't supposed to be a review. It's more like a word of warning, so we don't really need to get into every little thing. With that in mind, let's get to the main point of the video, which is why I don't think you should buy Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. Also, just so you know, I will be talking about some of the stuff I liked during this section as well. My intent is not to crap all over the game, but instead to give you some opinions, both positive and negative, based on my experiences. So where do we start? Well, I think the biggest sticking point the game has is its performance and presentation. I'm all but certain we can agree on that. I mean, it's not exactly a secret, is it? We've seen it literally everywhere since the release on November 18th. We've seen almost unplayable frame rates, glitches, bugs, crashes, and resolution that makes Sega Saturn games look modern. The thing is though, bad graphics or even low resolution can sometimes be overlooked if the game is fun to play, but it's much harder to give a pass to a game that feels so unpleasant to play due to poor performance. Simple acts such as moving the camera can cause the frame rate to tank, and the worst part is, it's not a quick drop here and there. It's pretty much a constant fluctuation, and that can legitimately make people feel sick or give you minor headaches. It feels unstable, like it could all just fall apart at any second. I've played the game for nearly 40 hours over 4 days. I have literally no life to this thing, and there wasn't a single moment where I felt like it was running properly. It was occasionally doing the bare minimum, but at every turn you're just reminded of how good this could have been, which honestly doesn't feel great. The resolution, as far as I understand it, is supposed to be 720p in handheld mode and 1080p while docked. So far that sounds pretty much right, but then you actually look at the game and you realize that all of the in-game textures and assets are produced at a much lower resolution and quality. On top of that, the game doesn't seem to feature any kind of anti-aliasing to smooth out those jagged edges on the low-end models. Textures are blurry, low-res, and honestly pretty ugly, while the environments are large, empty, and mostly barren, especially if you look at it from any kind of distance. Sometimes I'll walk through an area or a town and think, wow, I see what they were going for here, you know? But then, as usual, you're reminded of how much better this should look in 2022. As I said earlier, graphics aren't everything, not by a long shot, but I don't believe this is the best they could do. Personally, I think the developers simply don't have enough time to make the game look and work as it should due to their packed development pipeline. I don't think the devs are lazy, and I don't think they're incompetent. I don't have any proof of this, but I don't believe they're given enough time by the upper management to make this stuff properly. The ground floor coders and artists are doing the best they can to make the game under their current conditions. Nintendo is a large corporation within the gaming industry, and what have we learned about large corporations within the gaming industry? We've learned that they care about profit above all else, including consumer satisfaction, good PR, and of course, their own employees. This is not news, and it's also not an opinion. It's been demonstrated and proven countless times over the years. But I think it's fair to say that Nintendo generally gets a free pass, but not from me. The frame rate doesn't fare any better, by the way, but again, frame rate isn't everything. In fact, I've heard a lot of people say that we wouldn't even care about frame rates if places like Digital Foundry wasn't picking games apart, but I'm not so sure. I'm okay with games being 30 FPS if they stick close to it and look somewhat decent, even if they have bad frame pacing. Bloodborne being a perfect example of that, although that's obviously not a Switch game. The frame rate is all over the place in Scarlet and Violet, and I've had many instances where it ran so poorly that it was unplayable or made my stomach turn. Having the frames fluctuate, drop, and recover over and over again as you turn the camera is hard to look at sometimes, especially on a larger TV. The game does perform a tiny bit better in handheld mode, which I tried for a few hours, but it's marginal. I found an article online that gives some workarounds to make performance more bearable, and I think the simple fact that this article exists at all tells us everything we need to know. It suggests always playing in handheld mode, it suggests going into the settings of your TV and capping the resolution to 720p, and it also says that you should reset your game often to avoid memory leaks which supposedly cause crashes. No, I'm sorry, but that's ridiculous. I shouldn't have to do that with a product that I paid full price for. And look, you guys know how I am. I'm always more than fair with video games on this channel. It's just how I do things, even if I don't like the game myself. But things like games being broken on launch or monetization being particularly predatory are things that I just cannot accept. Some of you might be thinking, well, you bought the game and you're telling us not to, so what's up with that? Well, yes, you're absolutely correct. I bought the game for my channel at full price, but if I didn't have a YouTube channel, I probably wouldn't have bought this game after seeing everything that I saw online regarding its problems. I would have at least waited to see if it could be improved first. I guess I just don't want to reward this kind of release because, as with many other gaming companies, continuing to purchase this kind of stuff will simply increase the amount of it we receive. I've seen a few other viewpoints out there that sort of wave away the problems entirely or say, oh, it's the Switch's aging hardware that's the issue. I respectfully disagree regarding the hardware, although I'd be an idiot to say that it isn't at least a factor. And the reason I disagree is that we've already had some large, expansive games on the Nintendo Switch that look and run a hell of a lot better than Scarlet and Violet do. That's why my current theory makes sense to me. I feel like the developers just aren't getting the time they need to create and polish. You see, to put things simply, corporations want to make products for us to consume, and developers want to make art for us to enjoy. When these two things mix, you get games that are essentially compromised, and in my opinion, that's what's happened here with Scarlet and Violet. Don't get me wrong though, the Nintendo Switch hardware really doesn't help, and I could of course be completely wrong about all of the other stuff, but this is what I'm currently thinking is happening. The game actually annoys me sometimes because of how fun it can be, even when the world you're exploring looks like it's melting around you. The quality of life improvements to the Pokémon formula are great, and for me, collecting Pokémon hasn't been this enjoyable in ages. I'm not a competitive player at all, I've never played any Pokémon video game against another real-life player. And that's because for me, it's all about the adventure and the collecting aspect. Despite how this game looks and plays, I can see myself attempting to catch them all. When I bought the game, I actually went halves with the missus on that double pack that has the gold steelbook included with it. She's been playing Scarlet and I've been playing Violet. We've had virtually the same experience in terms of being worried that we'd hate it and then being surprised and actually enjoying it. We're both finding it kind of addictive if I'm being honest, but again, the plethora of technical problems dampen that enjoyment. I wouldn't say that it ruins the game entirely, but the state that it's currently in is almost a worse situation. I mean, if it was, beyond broken and the gameplay was genuinely awful, I could just write the game off and stop playing it. However, I like the game, a lot in fact, but I'm constantly disappointed and almost angry at the complete lack of polish. It's like Stockholm Syndrome at this point. I'm starting to identify with my captor. In all seriousness though, there's so much good here and it makes me all the more upset when I think of what it could be. And look, I'm not asking for Nintendo to make a Series X or PS5 equivalent, although yes please, I would be first in line, but could you imagine for a moment a Pokémon game that runs at 1440p or even 4K at 60 FPS? High resolution textures, incredible detail and effects. I mean, imagine exploring a Pokémon world that looked like Ghost of Tsushima's open world. I understand that Nintendo aren't about that kind of thing, they never really have been, but what if they were? The thing is, it doesn't matter what Nintendo puts out because the fans will buy it anyway. I feel like there's more adult Nintendo collectors out there in the world than normal everyday fans who just buy the games, although I know that's not actually true, it just feels that way these days. I love my Nintendo Switch, I genuinely do, I play it all of the time, but when you try to rush development, you get an unoptimized ugly mess like this. It's just what happens. I wasn't able to get footage of everything, but the game suffers from awful texture work, aggressive pop-in, flickering NPCs, and I haven't even mentioned the NPC animation yet. If any NPCs are more than, say, 10 to 15 feet away, their animation frame rate seems to be halved or perhaps even lower than that. You can see examples of this literally everywhere, and while it's not exactly a deal breaker, it's just objectively not nice to look at. Even in cutscenes when characters are up close, the animation is stuttering and just very distracting. I mean, look at this windmill, which is supposed to be the centerpiece of this town. Does it ruin my entire experience to catch and collect Pokémon? No, it doesn't, but once again, it is pretty distracting. These last couple of points are just some things that I would have liked to have seen in the game, and I have to say, I think it's about time for voice acting. A lot of these story scenes and the world as a whole feel a bit lifeless and flat. One of the main paths, which I won't spoil here, has a few sad moments in it, and when the character cries and gets upset, there's just nothing but text. It feels so empty and soulless. So yeah, I'd really like them to get some voice acting in the next one, even if it was just for the main cutscenes. Another thing that isn't really to my tastes is a lot of the new Pokémon designs. To be fair, there's quite a few of the smaller Pokémon that look spot on, but when they evolve, you either roll your eyes, vomit, or scream into a pillow. I mean, I can't say that they're objectively bad because that wouldn't be fair, but for me, subjectively, I think most of them are pretty awful. Funnily enough, my current party in the game is almost all older Pokémon, like Ampharos, Salamence, and Azumarill. The one new one that I'm using is Fuecoco's final evolution, which I won't spoil here in case you don't want to see it yet. I'm not super into the cover monsters either, which are Koraidon for Scarlet and Miraidon for Violet. The way you actually use them is very helpful for getting around the game world, but I really don't like the idea of the Pokemon being a bike. I have to say though, it's not as bad as I was expecting it to look or feel simply due to how useful it actually is. You definitely use it a lot, so you do kinda get accustomed to it, but either way, I'm not a fan of the cover monster being given to you right at the start of the game like that. I think the terrestrialized system is actually a great addition to the game and probably one of the better gimmicks that we've had since Mega Evolution. I like the fact that you could have a fire type that could change its type to water, or a dual type grass and fairy that could change its type to ice. I don't know exactly how tactical this system is, but it's a fun concept and it does work for me within the game's context. The thing I don't like about it is how it looks. I think if they simply crystallized the Pokemon itself, then it would have been really cool, but no, they had to go and give them these giant crystal hats. I don't want to be too harsh about it, but they look really stupid to me. I just do not like the visual design of the gimmick, but again, like with most things, that'll come down to your personal tastes. There's a lot more I could talk about, both in terms of things that I liked and things that I didn't, but as I said earlier, this isn't really supposed to be a review. I suppose the main thing to take away from this video is that gameplay-wise, it's the most fun I've had with a mainline Pokemon game in many years. Sadly though, it's crippled by horrendous technical shortcomings and generally feels very rough to engage with. It's got great new ideas, helpful quality of life additions, more freedom than ever before, and as far as I'm concerned, it's a bit of a diamond in the rough. There's flashes of brilliance here, but it's all covered in so much grit, dust and grime that it can be extremely hard to spot it most of the time. Ultimately, if I didn't have a YouTube channel, I would not have bought the game. I don't hate Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, I think I've made that much clear, but my advice would still be to save your money, at least for the time being. That said, I'm sure everyone that wanted it has probably already bought it at this point, and this video isn't really for those people. This video is for the players who are on the fence about a purchase or perhaps have never even played a Pokémon game before. I actually think that some new players would potentially be turned off of the series if they played this as their very first Pokémon game. My advice would be to simply wait and see. There's plenty of other great games on the Switch for you to play in the meantime, but if Game Freak can patch the game to an acceptable standard, then yeah, I'd absolutely recommend Scarlet and Violet without a doubt. If you enjoyed the video, I really hope you'll consider subscribing, and if you like what I do and want to help support the channel, please check out the first link in the video description down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.